Oh, Brian, do you want me to move the podium over here? Or it don't matter. I already if you've adjusted, awesome.
Oh, you good? Oh, sorry.
No, you're fine. That's a cool mouse. I've never seen that.
Yeah, just a little
Right
Logitech.
Right?
Okay, you're up.
Are you good, Brian?
Yep.
Great. The Lord be with you. We greet those who are here in person as well as those who are online. I keep hearing so many folks who either aren't able to come to church or who are right now getting ready to sing in the choir that are so glad that we are streaming these classes. So we welcome those, again, in person as well as those joining us either right now or later on YouTube. This morning, we welcome Matt Skolnick, Reverend Matt Skolnick, General Presbyter of Muskingum Valley Presbytery, who has some great deal of experience with Palestinian Christians, and will be sharing that experience. Just want to give you a little idea of what the next few weeks hold, and then I'm going to open us in prayer and turn things over to Matt. So this week, Reverend Matt's here. Next week, Pastor Ben is going to come, and he's going to be teaching about Fred Rogers. Next Sunday is Fred Rogers Day, right? So if you have a cardigan, especially a red cardigan, wear your Fred Rogers cardigan, right? I think I'm going to try to figure out how I can make that happen with a clergy attire, but we'll figure it out. So if you can, wear a cardigan next week. In 2 weeks from today, I'm back teaching on our friend Alcuin from the 8th century and Bruce Metzger, 20th century Princeton theologian and scholar. So look forward to the next couple of weeks and then a whole bunch of other stuff beyond that. Before I turn things over to Matt, let us pray together. Gracious God, we give you thanks for the gift of this day and for the opportunity to come together. We thank you for your Holy Spirit, your presence here among us and drawing us together. We thank you that you are here because we do gather in your name, Almighty God, and we give ourselves to you this day. And we ask that we may be taught and that we may learn about your church, your saints and sinners, about the church across the world there in Palestine. Help us to be open to receive of whatever we learn today. Help us to be transformed, not just by knowledge, but in our hearts. May we grow and be transformed into the likeness of your Son. May we seek peace. May we grow in compassion and love for you and for our neighbor in all that we do and all that we say. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Matt.
Thanks so much, Michael. Good morning, everybody. It's good to be back. We're having some tech problems. Hopefully the slides will get up on the screen. Are we there? Okay. So I'm going to be doing just a brief overview of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as I see it, and I have experienced it. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a very famous conflict. You probably have particular images in your mind, a particular understanding. One of the things that I've learned as I have traveled and got to know people is that it's a lot more complicated in one sense than you might know. And so really today, we only have an hour. I just want to give you, can I slide through? Or?
Yeah, you should be able to click through it.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you so much. We're good to go. Just want to give you kind of a brief overview of it. And it's worth a larger conversation. And I know that some of you go with the church now and again to Israel. And if you ever make that trip, I would encourage you to keep some of these things in your head. Has anyone ever been to Israel who's here with? Okay, plenty of you. So you've seen some of these places, which is pretty good. These are two pictures that I took. The left is on the top of the Temple Mount, which of course is where the Dome of the Rock is, where Muslims worship. Those are some Muslims praying, and on the right we have the Kotel, or the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall. There is a Hasidic Jew who is praying. I find it very helpful as we get into topics like this, not only to give an overview, but right away I'm going to give you some concluding thoughts. And the reason for that is if I don't give you those concluding thoughts right up front, I find that people tend to get a little bit confused, or they might assume that I think one thing or don't think another thing, and I just want to put that there. So we'll start with some concluding thoughts. I'm going to share my pathway into the conflict, which really has to do with my upbringing, my how I was taught to think about it, how I was tied to it. We all have a pathway into the conflict, and I think it's really important as we look at that to identify what our pathway or what our perspective is and what has formed that perspective. I have we might not be able to show this. I had a video. I had to change the format, but I had a video in my PowerPoint, which probably won't be able to be shown. And that is the human cost. And then the reality on the ground that you may or may not know. And then finally, some noteworthy books. As I walked in this morning, somebody said, "Oh my goodness, you brought a library?" And the reason for that is I just want to spend a few moments introducing you to some key books that have influenced my thinking and my understanding along the time. And if you're somebody who likes to read, these books would be absolutely excellent for you. Before I go any further, can someone remind me, when do we officially finish? 10:15. Okay, very good. It's all good. So what we're going to do right now is I just want to give you some of those concluding thoughts. And there's some basic thoughts, but they will help you understand where I'm coming from. The first is really a basic tenet that I've learned in life. There are amazing people and there are not so nice people everywhere. So I'll just give you an example. If you go to Cleveland, there'll be someone that you want to sit down and have a cup of coffee with, have a drink with. There will be people that you don't want to talk to. The same is true with all groups of people. There are Christians that I would really enjoy spending time with. There are other Christians I would not enjoy spending time with. The same is true if you think about Jews or Israelis or Palestinians or Muslims. In fact, some years ago, I was doing some work with some churches in Iraq. And when I was in Iraq, one of the people who took the best care of us was a Muslim man. And that was my first introduction to a Muslim in the Middle East. And I wasn't expecting that he would be the one who would be our caretaker as we were working with churches in the Middle East. The next thing that is really important is to understand that when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's really a no-win situation, and people are, at this point, born into it. If you are born as an Israeli, that is the system that you're there. If you're born into the Palestinian system, you have a little different perspective. But the people who are there now really have no choice in the matter. It's really what has happened in the past 100 years or so that has framed the conflict as we know it. Finally, or not finally, but next, it's really important, is that the traditional political models have failed for decades. So you might remember in the 90s, the peace accords with Clinton, none of that has been helpful. You go back before that, Carter, Nixon. The United States, for a long time, since the Second World War, has tried to massage this, tried to make it better, and all those political discussions have not really moved the bar. And so I'm not going to get into great detail about those political discussions, but some of them are, one-state solution, two-state solution, all those types of things. What I have found, and what I firmly believe in, is that there is a need for a relationship model. Unless people can know each other and trust each other, you can't really talk about a one-state solution or a two-state solution. And there are amazing groups out there that work on relationship models. Let me just back up and let you know what influenced my thought on that. There was a gentleman who served in Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, who was a missionary professor there, who came from South Africa. He was a white man, and he was in South Africa at the heart of apartheid. And during that tense situation, during those tense times, it was his experience that what helped change the arc of apartheid in South Africa is when the young whites and the young blacks got together and started eating dinner together. And it was at that point that they started to see some momentum. With that being said, Yanni, the professor at PTS, made it clear to me that as he walked into those relationships, he lost his relationship with his father. It was absolutely never the same. And again, his father was built in to that system. They were born into that particular system. I'll just mention a few types of organizations who do wonderful work with relationships. I'll probably mention them again later on. The first has to do with children's camps. There are a lot of organizations who will take Israeli children and Palestinian children and send them to camp together for a week. And the reason that this is important is that as time has gone by and as the structure of the society has changed, it used to be that Israelis and Palestinians would have an ability to at least have a personal relationship. That has become harder and harder over the years. And I'll give you some examples of that later on. Another type of organization that does some tremendous work is something that's called the Parents Circle, which takes Israelis who have lost children and Palestinians who have lost children to the conflict and helps build conversation between them. As people who grieve together, they do some amazing work as well. So again, I find it very helpful to give you some concluding thoughts up front so you understand kind of where I am coming from. Pathways into the conflict. Here are some pictures here that mean a lot to me. If you look in the top left-hand corner, there's two men. To me, they look an awful lot alike. They're white, they're relatively short, they're round, they're bald, they have glasses, they have big smiles. The man on the left in the black and white, you may know him as Levi Eshkol. Levi Eshkol was the third prime minister of Israel. He was the prime minister during 1967 when Jerusalem, in the Israeli terminology, was reunited, where the Jews took Jerusalem over again. He was born outside of Kyiv, which is in the news right now, and before he went to Israel in 1914, if my memory is correct, his last name was Skolnick, which happens to be my last name. If you look on the right, that's my grandfather. His name is Herman. Herman and Levi were born about 10 years apart. Both were born outside of Kyiv into Jewish families. Herman, in 1913, came to the United States as a young boy, immigrated into Philadelphia, and my great-grandparents at that time, as they were running from the larger political pressure that was placed on the Jews and the social pressure that was placed on the Jews in Europe, they just assimilated. You might know some Israelis right now. Some are religious, some are not religious. I would have put my grandfather in a family that was a non-religious family. And so I only heard it a few times when I was a kid, but I was told that my grandfather would always say that Levi, as we went to Israel, that Levi changed to Levi. Levi Eshkol was his cousin. Now, to me, that's a lot like Miller, right? How many Millers are there? There's probably a million Millers or Yoders around. What does it mean to be related? But that being said, there was that identification in my mind as a kid. The other thing that I had to fight through, which is also very interesting, is that I was told, again, only a handful of times as a kid, but it stuck in my mind, is that my last name was in the scriptures. So if you look in the book of Numbers, for example, there are other places, it speaks of the Valley of Eshcol. Now, Eshcol just simply means cluster or grapes. The reason that I bring this up is because whether you're talking to an Israeli or whether you're talking to a Palestinian, there's often half-truths, or there's often something that just doesn't make sense in history. And let me just explain this. Is it true that my last name is in Scripture? No. But to my grandfather, it was true. So if you look at the history of my last name, Skolnick, Skolnick is a Slavic Ukrainian name. It means one of two things. It either means something to do with a school, if you look it up. The other thing that it says, it has something to do with a synagogue. Well, again, Slavic Ukrainian, but it was Levi Skolnick, who went to the Holy Lands, as we might call them, who changed his name to Eshcol, which happened to be in the Bible. So do you see the difference? My last name is not in the Bible, but I was told that my last name was in the Bible. And again, if you talk to Israelis and Palestinians, what you're going to find out is that there's a lot of stories like that that are kind of true, but not really true at the same time. And so one of the things that I've learned in getting involved and listening to stories and meeting people is really to take everything with a grain of salt, or really come at it with like, okay, that may be true or that may not be true. The other place that I see this is just a basic human tendency, is when I have visited Egypt. You know, when you're in Egypt with some Christians, it's always like Jesus had his water bottle here. Everybody give me $5. Jesus was here, right? Jesus took a nap over here. Give me $10 and I'll give you a cup of tea, right? And so there's a lot of that is going on. The next set of pictures is, again, it was just kind of introduced into my life, is my matzo ball soup. Even though my grandfather was not a practicing Jew, and even though my father grew up in a house that was not religious at all, I did get some of the food traditions that were passed down to me. And the reason that that is important is, if you know anything about culture, food helps inform our culture. And so just these first set of images puts me in a category to think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from one perspective. And that has played out throughout my life. The next picture is a Shabbat candle. We have local friends in the Canton area who go to the local temple that you guys are associated with. We celebrate with them on a fairly regular basis. Not only just Shabbat, but we'll celebrate the high holidays and whatnot. The next is a picture that I found. I just took it out of a Shabbat service. Sometimes I find words that are in the Friday night service or the Saturday morning service that are meaningful to me as a Christian. And so, again, all of this plays in. Now, that influences my thought on one hand, but I also entered into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a more significant way through the Arab perspective. In 2011, if I'm not mistaken, was the Arab Spring. And I was fascinated by the Arab Spring. And so I started talking to people and figuring out what I could do to learn more. And before I know it, I was on a trip to Iraq and to Jordan and to Egypt. And I met a lot of Christians and a lot of Muslims there as well. In the top left-hand corner, or excuse me, the top right-hand corner is a man by the last name of Nasser. He's a Palestinian. His family has historically owned a farm called the Nasser Farm, which is just outside a little town we call Bethlehem. Bethlehem is technically in Palestine. He is a Palestinian, and he and his family have a very particular story that has influenced me. I'll speak more of him later on. The next, in the bottom left-hand corner, the diamond. My dad, for whatever reason, I grew up in Pittsburgh, he loved this tiny little family-owned Jewish jeweler. And so every piece of jewelry that my father bought, we went to Mr. Katz out in Monroeville. And when I bought my wife her engagement ring, I went there because that's the jeweler that I knew. That's not her engagement ring, it was just a ring I found online. That I knew. I went to him, I started a conversation, we're doing sizing, talking about cut, clarity, all that kind of stuff. And Mr. Katz goes on a tirade about there is no such thing as a Palestinian. And I think, oh, okay. I was in my 20s, I didn't really know anything about it. But that was part of my mind. And again, remember when I say that things are true, kind of true, not true? We frame the issue in particular ways. Well, if I look at Mr. Nasser in the top right-hand corner, he's a Palestinian. What Mr. Katz meant was that there was no, or let me rephrase that. The truth behind what Mr. Katz was saying was that there was no modern state ever called Palestine. Again, do you see the difference between the two? The next picture, you'll see me, the tall one, right next to the diamond ring. The tall one right outside the Kotel, the Wailing Wall. I was with a small team that spent a lot of time in Jordan. And in Jordan, we cared for refugees, largely Iraqi refugees, who were coming into Jordan. And one of the most memorable days that I ever had in the Middle East was being at the birth of an Iraqi church in Amman, Jordan. And as I got to know some of those people, after the celebration, we went to a tiny little home and we had tea, and when we left, I don't know if the gentleman picked me because I was the biggest, the ugliest, and I'm a notable man, you can't miss me. He said to me, "Promise me that you will go to the president of the UN so that I can go home." And what he meant by that was that even though he was most recently from Iraq, his parents and his grandparents were from Palestine. And in the 1960s, during the Six-Day War, they were pushed out. Now, that's an interesting statement because what am I going to do with the UN? You think little old Matt's going to walk up to the UN and solve this international crisis? No, but again, it starts to inform what I'm thinking. I'm going to skip some of the pictures, but I'm going to go right now to the second from the right on the bottom. There's a gentleman who's sitting with a bunch of kids. His name is Zugbi. Zugbi is a Christian who was born and raised right in Bethlehem. Still works in Bethlehem. He's a Palestinian. He will say, I forget the particular order, but somebody in his family is a Lutheran, somebody in his family is an Episcopalian, and somebody in his family is Catholic. But so he has some type of Christian upbringing. He's a person of faith. And actually, when I served a small church in our presbytery, I had the pleasure of bringing him to my congregation. And so these are all the little kids in our congregation surrounding Zugbi. And that was kind of a fun thing because, how often do you get to see somebody who was born in the same place Jesus was born, right? Literally Bethlehem. Again, he is a Palestinian, and you'll notice around his neck is his Palestinian scarf. There are two faces to the right of him that some of you probably know, Shai and Mayana. They were shlachim over at the temple. They were based in Akron, but they also worked with the Jewish temple here in Canton. This would have been maybe 2013, 2014. They're both Israelis. They're both Jewish. Like my grandfather, they're not particularly religious at all, but they are wonderful people. And I still keep in pretty significant contact with them. In fact, I've had contact with both of them in the past week several times about Ukraine because of the Jewish connection to the Ukraine and just trying to figure out what is going on. Now, Shai, who's the man in the back, he, like all Israelis, go through a period of time where they either have to serve in the military or they have to do some volunteering for the country, like in an AmeriCorps, but the Israeli version. He served in the IDF. Guess where Shai was located? Where he served? Bethlehem. Guess who were both in Canton at the same time? Zugby and Shai and Mayana. One of the most joyful things that I ever did was introduce Shai and Mayana to Zugby. Now here's the interesting thing about their particular story. Zugby is about 10 years older than me. Shai and Mayana are about 10 years younger than me. That 20-year gap or so has been a significant cultural shift in the life of Israel and Palestine. Zugby was very clear that when he grew up, he could still be friends with Israelis. Shai and Mayana, in a different time, the only interaction that they had with Palestinians was the violent interactions and the interactions that Shai had as an IDF officer in Bethlehem. Otherwise, they are completely separate. And so this goes to the heart of what I tried to say earlier, that relationships are really important. If you don't even know each other, if you can't play together, if you can't share a meal together, if you can't even fight together in a healthy way, what is the chance of moving forward? So all of that paints my picture, or kind of my pathway. And you'll notice that I'm split, right? On one hand, I really identify with the Jewish narrative, the Jewish history. On the other side, I know a lot of great Palestinians as well. Okay. So I don't think this is going to play because we had to change it to a PDF, but this is a video, and I'll see if I can send it to Michael. It's only 2 or 3 minutes long, but for me, it's a very powerful video. What I did is I took images out of newspapers and out online journals of people who were mourning in Palestine because they lost somebody, and people who were mourning in Israel who lost somebody. And what I really try to do when I do a presentation like this is to remind people that there is a huge human cost on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side. The reason that this is so important to me is because sometimes when we get into conversations, we only hear about the suffering of one side. As somebody who doesn't live in the region, as somebody who doesn't have to deal with the conflict on a daily basis, I think it's really important to stop and to remember that people are born into both sides. The Israelis might have a little bit more political power, they might have more military power, but people on both sides are suffering. Okay. Give you just a brief overview of some of the realities that are on the ground. Before I get there, I do want to mention a little bit about history. Some people, or when I first got involved with the topic, I heard a lot that this is a conflict that goes back thousands and thousands of years. The truth of the matter is that this is a conflict that is a direct result of what has happened in the past 150 years. Everyone knows the Jewish plight out of Europe. Before the Second World War, for 100 or 150 years before then, starting with what some scholars would say Rousseau, starting with Rousseau's philosophy, life for Jews in Europe got increasingly bad. And they decided that they needed to find a way out. They were not They didn't have a land of their own. They didn't have a place of their own. They had a law of their own, but they had no self-determination. And if you look into the early Zionist history, there were 3 places where the Jews talked about going. They're unlikely places. One's in Africa, Uganda. They thought about buying up significant tracts of land in Uganda. They also thought about going to Argentina. And then the third place that they thought about going was what they would call their ancestral homeland, the Holy Lands. Eventually, some of the Zionist leaders who weren't particularly religious decided that the only place that would invite an overflowing response of the Jewish people was Israel. And that's where they eventually ended up. I'll speak more about that when we get to some of the key books that you might enjoy. But that's really the start of the conflict, is going into a land where people already lived. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Here's an interesting thing you may or may not have noticed on the ground, as some of you have been in Israel. In Israel, your license plate is denoted by your ethnicity. If you're Israeli, or if you're Jewish, you get a yellow license plate at the top. If you come from an Arab background, you get a white license plate. The interesting thing about this is you start thinking of it from a Western perspective. Can you imagine 100 years ago in the United States? I guess we didn't have cars. too much and too many license plates. But anyways, can you imagine in the 60s, like black people had to have one license plate and white people had to have another license plate, right? I mean, that's kind of the level of crazy that's on the ground right now. The other thing that is a significant difference between the two cultures is building. Because Israelis have all the political might and all the military might, they just build and build and build. And so actually the top picture is something that I took in Jerusalem. There's a place in Jerusalem where you can stand and just kind of turn around and you just see crane, 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 constantly building. And the Israelis are very proud of this. There are other places. The bottom picture is actually not far from the Garden of Gethsemane in Jerusalem. It used to be a traditional Palestinian home. What has happened is that in the Middle East, just like in biblical times, family has a son marries, the new wife comes in, they stay in the same place, and they have to get a bigger home, right? Because the family just continues to grow. The house of the father is what we call that in biblical terms. Well, for Palestinians, if you're in a place that is wanted by the Israelis, they have all sorts of hurdles that you have to go through to do building, and the permit is outrageously cost, or they just can't afford it. And so what happens is Palestinians start to build onto their home that they own without a permit, and then IDF comes along and just knocks the home down. There's a reality of the ground. You're going to see a handful of maps up here. This map, I think, comes from the BBC. But what's so important for me in this particular map is that the West Bank, which is east of Jerusalem mostly, up to the west bank of the Jordan River, is really a lot of Swiss cheese. In 1966, before Jerusalem was reunited and before Levi Eshkol commanded the troops to go in and take Jerusalem back, all of the land in the West Bank was considered Palestinian. And so what has happened over time, if you look at all the different colors, little pockets of Jewish neighborhoods would come in, and this is really a huge piece of the conflict right now. They just set up land and say, okay, I'm going to live here, and then it's kind of an outpost, and then it grows. And it grows in a variety of ways. So if you look at the map here, there's Israeli control, Israeli military control, Israeli civil control, and it just goes out. If you could imagine living in the West Bank as a Palestinian, you might imagine that it would be hard to see someone coming in and taking over what has historically been your land. And so there's a lot of violence that happens there. One of the things that a lot of tourists are not keenly aware of as they visit the Holy Land is what's denoted in that red line. That red line is what we call the security barrier from the Israeli perspective. If you talk to a Palestinian, a lot of Palestinians will call it an apartheid barrier. It's so funny how they have different names for everything. So for example, in the Middle East, there's a very common salad that has cucumbers, tomatoes, and kind of a vinaigrette. Israelis call it the Israeli salad, and Palestinians call it the Palestinian salad. They got it, everybody claims it kind of thing. But there are some notable regions. Do you see southwest of Jerusalem? That is Bethlehem. And in Bethlehem, there is a red circle. That wall encompasses Bethlehem, which creates a little prison inside of a larger land. The people who live in Bethlehem, like Zugby, have a really hard time going anywhere outside of their city. The other thing that I will mention to you, I'll show you this in a picture later on, because of the way that this security barrier has been divvied up, it doesn't necessarily honor property lines or even property lines within families. And so right between Jerusalem and Jericho, there's a very ancient road that goes between them. There's a Palestinian family who had, before Israel came along, had a business, and the brother lived on one side of the line and the other brother lived on the other side of the line, and they used to be able to walk back and forth between their homes. And now what they have to do is they have to go out and go through like 3 checkpoints, and 8 hours later, they can get back to 50 feet from their home building. So just trying to give you kind of the reality on the ground. It's difficult for everybody, but what I will say, it's significantly more difficult for Palestinians. Everybody has their own map and their own dates that they think are most appropriate. The one, and I'll just point, these are Palestinian maps. As they see the story, you'll notice that the third one in from the left, the one that's first largely black, it says 1960. That's how they viewed the land before another significant date. Another significant date was 1967, which that map would strategically change. So the Palestinian view is that way back in 1918, when Jewish settlers started coming in, all the land was Palestine. Again, it was not a modern nation state, but the people who live there have lived there for generations. In fact, if you talk to somebody like Zugby will say, I don't know how they keep track of this, for 17 generations, his family has been in Bethlehem. I can keep track of my family for 3, and then it goes a little bit crazy. I don't know where you are on your heritage scale, but what you need to understand in terms of the history of it all is that in about the year 1900, Jews were moving in the area and it was relatively peaceful. As Jews started coming in waves, they call them the aliyahs, the coming of home. There are several waves of Jews who come in between 1900 and 1920. And I think, if my memory is correct, it's like 1918 was when there was first huge tension where the people who lived on the land said, oh my goodness, you're taking over our land. And you can see how the land, according to the Palestinians, has changed in the past 100 years. We largely talk about the West Bank, which in the last 2 maps, you can see in 1960, the blue kind of in the center, the Swiss cheese version in 2017. But one place that we haven't talked about is on the far left corner, or the west corner. That little blue mark, that's the Gaza Strip. And to be quite honest, if Palestinians Palestinians have different lives. If you live in Jerusalem, if you live in the West Bank, if you live in Gaza, if you lived in the Golan Heights, the people who get the worst of it are in the Gaza Strip. And one of the ways, I know that for a variety of reasons, but one of the ways that I know that is in my trips to Egypt, there's a Presbyterian seminary in Cairo, and when I was visiting, they had just sent one of their students who was still in seminary to pastor churches in Gaza. And they were getting daily reports. This was back maybe in 2014. I think there was a big flare-up. And he just couldn't bury enough people during the day because of the bombs and the missiles that were going back and forth on such a regular basis. Okay. I mentioned to you the security wall according to Israel, or their apartheid wall according to Palestine. It looks different in different places. Some of you, if you've been there, may have noticed this. Some of you may not have wondered what it was, but that's what it is. I do want to bring your attention to the bottom right-hand corner. This was on the road between Jerusalem and Jericho. Remember I told you the story about the family where the two brothers had a business? Well, they had a little hole where they would pass papers and whatnot back and forth. And every time they build the hole, the Israelis come back and kind of block it up. And so there's little stories along the way. This is the security barrier that surrounds Bethlehem. On one side of the wall, the Israeli side, it is pristine, meaning there's no graffiti. On the Palestinian side, within Bethlehem, you'll just see all sorts of graffiti and artwork. There are a few notable things that take place. You see that little white boy? I forget his name. I want to say it's like Weldon or something along those lines, but he is a famous Palestinian cartoon that started in like the 1950s and the 1960s to try to say, hey, I'm a human kind of thing. And he shows up all over the place. And of course, you can see trying to play or to get some Western sympathies in Palestine. Okay, some other differences between the cultures. The top picture is an Israeli home. You have heated water tanks. One of the big issues in Israel and Palestine today has to do with water access. On the bottom side, while the Israelis have heated water tanks that are piped in through civil agencies, just like we have water that comes to our homes, Palestinians, even though the West Bank holds most of the water of Israel, Palestinians have to ship water in from Jordan on trucks. So Palestinians will have a big tank on top of their home, and once a month, if they can afford it, the truck will come in and dump off the water for them. This is between Jerusalem and the Sea of Galilee, whatever that highway is between the two. We stopped and we looked, and this is in technically the West Bank. It's technically Palestinian territory. On the right-hand side of the road as we were going north, which is the top, is the Israeli land. And you can see Israelis are very proud of their agricultural practices and how they turned the desert into a fruitful land. If you go back to Levi Eshkol, before he became prime minister, dealt with agriculture in Israel. They really celebrate this, but water access isn't always the same. So this is literally one side, the east side of the road and the west side of the road. One is Israeli, one is Palestinian, and it has to do with water access. In the Palestinian side, you'll see Israeli lettering, 1980. They have a pump. And again, I take everything with a grain of salt. I can only report what people tell me. What I was told is that pump is allowed to be turned on 1 hour a week. to get water for the little village in Palestine. This gentleman's name is Sam Bahr. What's interesting about Sam Bahr is, though he comes from Palestinian heritage, he was born and raised in Youngstown, Ohio. In his adult years, what he did is he went back to Palestine as an engineer, and just as there are discrepancies with housing and discrepancies with water, he tries to work on discrepancies for telecommunications. He tries to set up the system in the Palestinian side of life. Remember when I talked about Bethlehem being kind of in a big prison? There is a smaller fence inside of Bethlehem that sets up a UN refugee camp from the 1960s. And so some Bethlehemites aren't allowed out of the city. Other Bethlehemites aren't allowed out of their little area inside of Bethlehem. And this little UN camp tends to be a place where the Israeli Defense Force does a lot of practice with all their new recruits. And so this gentleman, the picture actually looks worse than it is. This gentleman was a youth director inside this UN refugee camp inside of Bethlehem. And what happens about 3, 4, 5 times a week, the IDF they practice their new recruits sending off tear gas and all sorts of stuff. This gentleman stuck his head out the window to call the kids in, and he took a rubber bullet in the head. Now, it's kind of a practice zone. He ended up being okay, but I wanted to show you this just so you understand again that there are different levels of struggle in different parts of Palestine. Places that are in these tiny little camps sometimes get the worst of it. Now, this one I find very humorous. I probably shouldn't find it humorous. There is a little town not far from Ramallah. Ramallah, of course, is Palestinian, just outside of Jerusalem. They're famous for their quote-unquote peaceful protests. And they do all sorts of demonstrations. And they even will dress up as Martin Luther King Jr., but the slingshot, just, peaceful protest, slingshot. I mean, it's an interesting thing as you look at it from the outside. Now, unfortunately, in this particular little town, they will tell you stories of Palestinians who will be killed on a semi-regular basis. Israel will say things like, well, we don't use lethal weapons. That might be true, but they have been used in lethal ways, and I'll just give you an example. Sometimes the Israeli Defense Force will go in, and they will have these tear gas launchers. At 100 meters, it's not lethal. But if you fire it at somebody who's 10 meters away from you, it is lethal. And so those are the types of things that happen. Skirmishes in this town between Israel and Palestine happen on a fairly regular basis. Going back to the history of it all, and I know we're coming to a close here, to me this is very powerful. This goes back to the 18th century. Jews were already feeling pressure in Europe. If you look at this screen, it comes right out of Rousseau, but there was a gentleman named Canton, and I'm not good at French. Anyone good at French can pronounce this name? There we go. Thank you so much. That Count stood up and was trying to defend the Jews in front of the French Parliament. And the quotation that he said, "To the Jews as individuals, everything. To the Jews as a nation, nothing." Now, that might not make a lot of sense, but the philosophy behind it comes from Rousseau. Rousseau set up kind of the modern nation state and basically said, if you're part of our society, you get all the blessings in the world of our society. What was the big problem with the Jews? They had a law of their own. So there was this tension that for all the liberty that France celebrated, they couldn't acknowledge that the Jews had their own Torah, that they had their own way of life. And so what the Count was trying to say was, if you come over as an individual Jew into the French society, you'll get all the blessings that you need. But if you come as a Jewish people, you can't come. And I'm going to try to get to some great books that we have here. Where is it? Oh, goodness, this one. This one is a great book that talks about Herzl, but nonetheless, it outlines the 200 years or so in Europe that preceded the mass exodus of the Jews. It's a very painful thing, and ultimately this is why the Jews tried to find a land of their own, because they were not welcomed in Europe. There are a couple people I want you to be aware of, and I guess I'm jumping ahead, that have to do with some books. Theodore Herzl is one of the founding fathers of Zionism, the movement of the Jews to Israel. He had two famous books that came out about 100 years ago. They're worth your time. The first is called The Jewish State, and it's his idea of how do we take all these people from so many other countries and put them in one place and organize them and care for them. It give you some insight. And he also has a utopian book, a novel called Old New Land, that was published in Germany. When you look at them, you'll see that as brilliant as he was, he underestimated what people would think about others coming into their homeland. So, for example, in the novel, you'll hear all sorts of stories about how the Palestinians who are there will be so thankful for all the technology and the medicine and the good ways of life that the Jews were going to bring to them. But he underestimated how they would respond when they were no longer the majority. The next person, to me, is a very interesting person in the Zionist movement. His name is Vladimir Jabotinsky. He hails, if my memory is from Odessa, which is in the Ukraine, which is in the news right now. Vladimir Jabotinsky happens to be the boss of a young man called Benjamin Netanyahu, who happens to be Bibi's father. Jabotinsky was a military mind and said, I'm sick of the Jews getting beat up. We have to be able to fight back. And so his image comes out of the best Jew, comes out in his novel, Samson. His novel is all about, we're not weak Jews, we are these big fighting, fierce Jews. Jabotinsky developed a philosophy that is called the Iron Fist, which basically says if we beat them into submission, eventually they will give up. All of that comes through Jabotinsky, but perhaps we don't have a ton of time to go into this. One of the best books is written by a Jewish man called Gershom Gornberg, called The End of Days. He looks at fundamentalists in all three faiths, the fundamentalists in the Christians, the fundamentalists in the Jewish world, and the fundamentalists in the Muslim world, and talk about how they view the end of the world and how the Temple Mount pictures into that. Now, it's a little bit scary when people are motivated by the end of the world. This is an extremely helpful book. All of that plays into politics and plays into our understanding, and it comes into our culture as well. I don't have time to go through all of these things. These are two gentlemen, one's an Israeli, a Palestinian, both fathers who lost daughters to the conflict. They are in something called the Parents Circle together. The Nasser farm, it's also called the Tent of Nations. The Tent of Nations, if you know anything about olive trees, they say you plant an olive tree for your grandchild. It takes a long time to develop an olive tree. They've had this farm outside of Bethlehem. The trees have been ruined in the conflict. I do want to just mention in the last couple minutes some additional books that are easy to get into. This one is called Like Dreamers. It is about the paratroopers in 1967 who captured Jerusalem from the Palestinians. What I love about this book, if my memory is correct, it goes through 7 different paratroopers. 7 significantly different lives and political perspectives, from far left to far right Israelis in terms of how they view the conflict, how they view the world, and they were all part of that paratrooping group who took over Jerusalem. It reminds me that even in Israel, there are diverse perspectives on the conflict. I would encourage you to look at that one. And perhaps the most accessible book is a book that is called Prisoners, a story of friendship and terror by Jeffrey Goldberg. Jeffrey Goldberg is a journalist in the States that you might know. I think he writes for the Politico now, if I'm not mistaken. But when he was out of college, he went as an American who grew up in New York City to serve in the IDF. And he was placed as a guard in a Palestinian prison. And this book tells the story of him building a relationship with a Palestinian prisoner who was known for violence. And it's really a haunting book. It gives you hints of hope that people can get along, but at the end of the book, they end up reconnecting years later outside of Israel and Palestine. And Jeffrey asked the question of his Palestinian friend, if we met on the streets in Israel, would you kill me? And his friend says, I would, but it wouldn't be personal. And so it's a very good book to get you into it. I have others here. I do recognize that we're coming to the close of our time. If you ever want more information or want to talk about the whole conflict, there's a lot to learn. And most importantly, I would encourage you that if you take another trip or if you go to Israel, just be aware of what's going on, because sometimes as tourists, we don't necessarily take in the larger picture. It truly is a very difficult life, both for Israelis and for Palestinians. More so in some cases for Palestinians because of the political and the military might that Israel has. And then again, different areas of Palestine have different areas of suffering. Thank you so much. Have a great day.